All righty, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Iconocast. My name is Tyler. This is Kendall, and we're in conjunction with the Southeastern Louisiana University's English Department Colloquium. Before we get started, we want to tell everybody to follow us on iconocast.org. We've had some wonderful guests, and we're moving forward with some great ones as well. And today's guest is a former faculty member here at Southeastern Louisiana University. I personally had her for critical thinking a while back, and I had a lot of growing pains intellectually following with that, but it was a wonderful experience. And it was really wonderful and exciting to see a faculty member have such an impact outside of academia, or we should say in other forms of academia.
Right.
So her book, last publication was Creationism's Trojan Horse. And she has done work across a lot of things, but the intelligent design movement and the wedge is principally what we'll be talking about today. But without further ado, we want to welcome Dr. Barbara Forrest. How are you doing, Dr. Forrest?
I'm fine.
Yeah, you're still in Hammond, is that right?
I don't live in Hammond. I've lived in Livingston Parish for over 50 years, but I'm still very close by.
Oh yeah. So you've gotten all this rain we've been getting this whole
Oh,
week.
yes.
Wonderful. Well, we'll get started. Go ahead, Kendall.
Yeah. So our first question is just for you to ask us to tell us about your education track. So where did you go to school and what did you study?
Well, I got a bachelor's in English from Southeastern, right where you're sitting. Thinking at the time that I wanted to be a high school English teacher, but that student teaching disabused me of that idea. So I went from a bachelor's in English to a master's in philosophy from Louisiana State University, Baton Rouge, and I went for my PhD in philosophy to Tulane in New Orleans.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, it is always great to speak to someone who also went here and also studied English.
Yes,
So-
and I got a very good education at Southeastern.
Right. We certainly think so as well. I feel like we're getting a great one here too. So we were able to find from some of our faculty members here that you used to do Holocaust studies really earlier on in your career.
Right.
Would you mind telling us about what your studies were about and how did this lead you to intelligent design?
Well, the study of the Holocaust did not lead me to the study of intelligent design. They were completely disconnected. I was interested in the Holocaust simply because I guess it's just the way I'm put together. I've always been interested in the inhumanity of humans to other humans, and how such things could happen. And it's what led me to want to be a teacher, because I think I consider the worst of all human afflictions to be ignorance. It leads to all of the other evils, I think. And so I did for a while. I taught a course about the Holocaust at Southeastern. I did a little bit of writing about it. But I think that actually got interrupted by what happened to lead me to the issue of creationism. So they're only connected in that I've always been the kind of person who never wanted to do the kind of philosophy that nobody would ever read. Philosophers have done a very good job of making themselves completely irrelevant to what happens in the world. And I've been to philosophy meetings and they just gave me a headache. So I never wanted to be a scholar who spoke only to other scholars inside my discipline. I wanted to speak to people outside the discipline. So that's what my interest in the Holocaust and also my interest in the issue of creationism do have in common. Other than that, there's no common connection. My entrance into the issue of creationism came as a personal involvement because I was trying to protect the education of my own children. And that led me to a completely new area of scholarship.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And we had discussed that. I know a lot of people who, when you tell them you're getting an education in humanities or following that, it appears to be a study of abstractions, especially versus STEM. And for you, it's unique to see that your studies have created a channel for humanities to apply to those STEM fields, and they can work together. Do you find that your experience as a humanist or a philosopher is unique among philosophy teachers, philosophers? Do you feel like you have a unique experience, or are we just It's just that's just a wrong understanding of what the humanities can provide.
Um, you're talking about my becoming a public intellectual and getting involved in issues outside academia.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, it's not very common that philosophers do this.
Right.
It's not anymore. It used to be. What's interesting is that the greatest philosophers were always interested in and very often involved in issues outside philosophy. And I'm a generalist. I'm interested in lots of things. I've never wanted to specialize and become so narrow in my focus that I could only talk to a few people. Well, Aristotle was like that. Aristotle was a generalist. He learned and wrote more about more different things than anybody of his age. And Aristotle was interested in politics. He was interested in science. Well, that's me. I'm interested in politics. I'm interested in science and how they intersect. And I think about David Hume. David Hume was a wonderful, important philosopher who was also interested in things other than philosophy, namely science, the science of his day, as was Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was very knowledgeable about both science and politics, and he was very interested in political developments in Prussia, where he was a philosopher. He pushed the envelope when it came to freedom of speech and freedom of publication under Frederick the Great. He was willing to take risks to get his ideas before the public. And what's interesting is that the philosophers that I have just mentioned were not interested in talking only to people like themselves. They were interested in talking to anybody who would listen and who could understand what they wrote. And so even though it's not very common right now anymore for philosophers to be interested in and involved in things outside academia, it used to be.
Yeah.
And I think philosophy, one of the reasons when I said philosophers have done a very good job of making themselves irrelevant, I'm talking about modern philosophers. Who have very little to say to anybody outside their disciplines, with a few exceptions. I have a friend at the University of New England and who writes about race and racial issues. He's very interested in how human beings treat other human beings, and he's very involved in that issue. So there are some, but it's not very common anymore.
Yeah. And for you, you've been very consistent with that because, this is Creationism, Trojan's Horse. This is a copy from Southeastern, but we were even able to find your master's thesis in which you talk about euthanasia.
Which I never want to talk about again.
Right. We don't need to talk about it. But
I did that. Yes, I did that subject thinking that would be an area of future interest. And my master's thesis was all it took to make me decide never, ever to go back to the issue of euthanasia. So
no, but yeah, not even to talk about that, but to highlight how
cool.
Yeah, but to highlight how you're always applying that philosophical understanding to real life circumstances. But go ahead.
And I have another good friend, if I could mention him, Robert Pennock, who is a philosopher of science. I'm not a philosopher of science. I'm a philosopher jack of all trades. But my friend Robert Pennock was one of the first people to address the issue of intelligent design as a philosopher of science. And I do want to mention him because he's been very involved in this issue as a public intellectual and not just a philosopher. So I would like to give a nod to Robert Pennock at Michigan State University.
Oh, good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Kendall, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, no, I was just saying, yeah, that's always awesome that you can recognize others who are also working towards the same ideas. So our next question for you is that it is surprising to see that your publication, Creationism's Trojan Horse, predates your involvement with the Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District case. What led you to publish that book specifically?
Oh, goodness. Can I go back to what happened when I was trying to protect my children's education?
Certainly.
Yeah, of course.
In 1994, I had a son who was a freshman in high school in Livingston Parish, and I had another child in elementary school. And that year, 94, 3 creationists who came from the New Orleans area approached the Livingston Parish School Board and tried to get a curriculum guide accepted for use in the public schools. Well, I was the only parent in the parish to protest that and to work against it. And it took 2 or 3 years to get that resolved. But I managed to do it. I managed to keep that with some help from some wonderful scientists, mostly from LSU. to keep it out of my children's schools, out of the public schools. And so then I started to write about it. I started that when I was involved in that issue was the first time I heard the term intelligent design. So this leads to the answer to your question. And I was working with the National Center for Science Education. It's a wonderful organization in Oakland, California, that is a clearinghouse for people who need assistance in protecting science education in whatever form the threat to science education arises. And for the first 25 or 30 years of its existence was creationism. And so I had been working with them. They had been giving me assistance, and they mentioned to me that there was, I told them about the term intelligent design popping up in this curriculum guide. And they make me aware of an organization in Seattle, Washington, the Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture, which was a subsidiary of a think tank called the Discovery Institute. And the staff at NCSE told me that these would be the people to watch because this was the headquarters of the intelligent design creationist movement. And that they were really right about that. These were the people, excuse me, who were promoting the idea of intelligent design, which other creationists around the country started to pick up. And so since I was now aware of them, I was also in touch with the people on, we had internet email lists, how people in the mid-90s would begin to talk to each other online, things like that. That became a new mode of communication. And I was in a circle of people who were watching this very issue. And there was a young man named Jim Still, who was the head of a group called the Internet Infidels, a bunch of young people who were interested in science and the issue of creationism. He requested that somebody write an article about the Discovery Institute's Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture. Well, I had already started watching these people, collecting information, and I volunteered to write that article. And that article grew into the book. I might add that Jim never got his article. He was willing to, there was so much to do and so much to write about that he was willing to forego the article in order to let me keep working on it. And I ended up with a complete manuscript, which was centered around a document called the Wedge document that someone had leaked out of the Discovery Institute's headquarters and made public on the internet, except that nobody could verify its authenticity. And in terms of matching it directly, connecting it directly to the Discovery Institute in a way independent of the leaker. The leaker gave it to another gentleman who gave it to me. And I was the one who managed to do that. I managed to find material on an old directory at the Discovery Institute's website that matched up perfectly with big chunks of the Wedge document. So the Wedge document was a 20-year plan for the Discovery Institute's Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture, which they renamed in 2002, the Center for Science and Culture. So that's what I'll call it. The Wedge document was an agenda covering a span of 20 years, beginning at about 1998, I think, of what they wanted to do. And one of their goals was to get intelligent design into public schools. And also wedge it, the term wedge, the Wedge document is what they called it. And they wanted to wedge into the academy, higher education. But my interest was what they had planned for the public schools. And so I ended up trying to document how they were advancing each one of the goals in that document. The program was set up in 3 phases, the first of which was publicity. And what I managed to find by looking at their own material, using their own written documents, their own announcements of their activities, I managed to see that they were making a lot of headway toward that, except in one area, and that was science. They weren't producing any original science. And that's always an important thing to take note of. So I ended up with a finished manuscript centered around the Wedge document. The word got around about it. Somebody at Oxford University Press heard about it, wanted to see the manuscript, and they were interested in it. And they wanted to publish, except that they wanted some scientific analysis to be done. And so they recommended a co-author. Paul R. Gross, who was a very distinguished scientist at the time. He ran the Woods Hole Marine Laboratory up at Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and he was the provost at the University of Virginia, so a very distinguished man. He agreed to come on as co-author and contributed all of the important scientific analysis of intelligent design in the book. And as a result of, after 3.5 years, no, 3 years and 8 months, we had a published book. It came out in January 2004. And we wrote the book knowing that at some point there would be a lawsuit, because the Center for Science and Culture was shopping around for a good place to generate a legal challenge. And little did we know that that lawsuit would come in less than a year. By December of 2004, a lawsuit had been filed in Dover, Pennsylvania, that generated the Kitzmiller case, in which I was called as an expert witness because of having co-authored that book.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's how I ended up with the book. Never set out to write a book, just ended up writing one, and it became an important source of information for the attorneys defending the plaintiffs in that case.
Yeah. Just to take a step back, we read an article that you discuss naturalism as a philosophical approach, and you use evolution as the cornerstone for that. Did you have that belief or that theory before you encountered this intelligent design movement, or did it develop from your relationship with that?
That's a really good question. I'm glad you brought up the subject of naturalism. Naturalism is a term in science. Actually, I've written articles about this. I wrote a lot about it, and it did stem from my work after writing the book, Creationism's Trojan Horse. It was generated out of that. I've written a lot of articles about naturalism. Naturalism is there to make it easy. There are two forms of naturalism: methodological naturalism, which is a procedural protocol that scientists use in their work in the study of the natural world. And then there's philosophical naturalism, which is a point. It's a way of understanding the world. So let me tell you what those two things are. When scientists do their work, it doesn't matter what area of science they're in. I'm talking about the natural sciences, but this is also, I think, true of the social sciences as well. They maintain an empirical stance, which means if you're studying the natural world, you limit yourself to natural explanations. You don't, for example, you don't go to a science class trying to understand the working of the cell and hear your professor say, well, the cell works this way because God designed it, and God makes the cells function in the way they function. Now, you may believe that as a matter of religious belief, but science cannot work on the basis of such an explanation. Explanations of how the natural world works have to be testable, and they have to be testable by reference to facts. And facts are obtained through the use of the senses. You have 5 senses. And so methodological naturalism is using naturalism as a method, a way of studying the natural world, and by developing, and in so doing, limiting oneself to the use of empirical data, which is available to anybody else that wants to see it, and relies on sense experience and is testable, and it is available for inspection by other human beings. And so using natural explanations to develop explanations of natural phenomena, that's naturalism as a method, methodological naturalism. And all scientists use that because it is the only way of developing explanations of the natural world that has yielded any success. Trying to explain the natural world supernaturally may be religiously satisfying, it's just not science, and it can't be tested. Philosophical naturalism is typically a way of understanding the universe that takes its beginnings from the yieldings of modern science. Science is really the most successful way of trying to understand the world that we have. And there is no way to verify the existence of the supernatural. There's no way to verify it that is public and shareable and knowable among all human beings. And so philosophical naturalists are people that develop their understanding of the entire universe on the basis of modern science. Now, that doesn't mean they ignore the humanities. You know, they typically are very involved in the humanities. And I might add, there are as many people from the humanities who get involved in the issue of protecting science as there are scientists. They very often are very concerned with protecting science for political reasons, for philosophical reasons, and even for religious reasons. But so philosophical naturalism is a worldview. It's a way of understanding everything by making sure that your understandings are rooted in the findings of science that can be shared and verified by other people. So methodological naturalism is the way of doing science. Philosophical naturalism is a way of understanding the world that science tells us about.
Yeah. That was part of what in the trial for what for the qualifying round. I don't know what it was specifically, but they brought that up a lot with you. But if they had read a few of the articles, they would have seen how it tied in, certainly. But that's not the point of a lawyer in a trial. But thank you for explaining that. Let's get to the book real quick, because there's some things about it that we really we saw applicable to what we've been studying.
Okay.
Creationism's Trojan Horse. Seems like the first chapter, there's this experiment of ethos, where there's this instructor, he's a faux instructor, right? And he's given
Dr. Fox.
Yes.
That was a real case, by the way.
Well, can you explain that case to them first, and then would you mind explaining how you tie that into your argument in creationism's Trojan Horse?
Okay, that's a good entree. That actually was contributed by my co-author. One of the things that is so unfortunately the case in the United States, and I'm sure it's true in other places, but we're most familiar with our own country, and that is the low level of scientific literacy, the woeful inadequacy of most Americans' understanding of basic science. And because Americans are to such not all of them, but a lot of Americans, I would say half, don't understand basic science. They're easy to hornswoggle. They're easy to fool. And there are even people who are intelligent people, very knowledgeable in some areas, that don't understand the way science works and how to actually establish when a person is doing proper science and when they're not. And there was a case of a man who posed as Dr. Fox. It was kind of part of an experiment. I forget all the particulars of it, but a gentleman purporting to be gave a talk. This has been filmed. You can look on YouTube. I'm sure you'll find his lecture. Presenting himself with a list of bogus credentials as an expert on something or other, giving a talk, and a lot of people got sucked in by it. Even people who should have known better. People who were smart in their own fields, maybe, but couldn't tell, very much about whether this man knew what he was talking about. The point is that he was an actor. He was a professional actor who was coached in how to present himself as an expert. He came in dressed as an expert and presented his material, whatever it was, very authoritatively, right, and very assertively. And people were influenced by his manner of presentation and his appearance, which was all an act of being a qualified expert. And my co-author wanted to start the book with that, to explain how it is that many people who are otherwise very bright people manage to get conned by creationists. And so we started the book with that because my co-author was a scientist, remember, and he wanted to show what scientists are up against when they're trying to help people understand the difference between pseudoscience and real science, or something that is, fake science and real science. And so hence the beginning of the book.
Yeah, and there's also doing digging. There's a website in which they try to challenge your ethos as well. Specifically, they did that. Did you see that, where they did this fake trial with you?
Oh, yeah, fake interview.
Yeah, the fake interview.
The word ethos applies to your moral credibility.
Right.
Mhm.
You know, your credibility as a scholar, someone who does real research and tells the truth about the research.
Right.
And that is something that every genuine, conscientious scholar wants to establish, so that your work will, number one, get a fair hearing so that it can be properly judged. And so I was called as an expert witness for in early 2005 in the case of the Kitzmiller case.
Yeah.
It was this Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District, and Kitzmiller was the lead plaintiff, a woman named Tammy Kitzmiller, who was a parent of a child in the public school, Dover Regional High School. And so I was called as an expert witness. And of course, the book was out. The Discovery Institute, or let me say the Center for Science and Culture, because the Discovery Institute has a number of different areas of interest. One of it started off as an organization interested in transportation issues in the Pacific Northwest, which is, you know, quite legitimate. But then they added, in the late 90s, they added the Center for Science and Culture, which was their creationist arm, and actually became the tail that began wagging that dog. It became the most important thing that they were doing. And so the Discovery Institute already knew about my work, and they knew about the book. And when I was called as an expert witness, they set out to discredit me, thinking that if they could do that, then my testimony in court would be less believable. And so you probably remember a little storm called Katrina.
Yeah.
You were probably really little at the time, but I was supposed to go and testify in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, as an expert witness in that case for the plaintiffs in September 2005. And Katrina delayed me for 3 weeks. And while I was stuck in Louisiana during those 3 weeks, I began to get emails or something about some interview that the Discovery Institute had done with me. And I looked at their website and I saw an interview that I had never done. I had never been interviewed by the Discovery Institute, by the Center for Science and Culture. And it turned out to be a fake interview in which they just set out to ridicule me. Instead of calling me Dr. Barbara Forrest, they called me Dr. Barking Forrest, like a barking dog.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that right there tells you that this is not an organization that is qualified to be promoting scientific ideas. To do something so silly and so juvenile, it just, it was unbelievable. And so they set out to discredit me. And thinking that they could undermine my testimony because they knew that my testimony would be damaging. But I did get up there. They rescheduled me for October, and I got there. And when I took the witness stand, the lead attorney for the Discovery Institute, by the way, did not generate this court case. The court case was something they actually tried to stop it because they didn't initiate it and couldn't control it. But they ended up getting involved with it because it was about their work. It was the Dover Area School Board had adopted a curriculum, a science curriculum for Dover High School, requiring the teachers to tell the students about intelligent design.
Mm-hmm.
And the Discovery Institute actually tried to get them to stop because they knew that they wouldn't be able to control that local case. But they ended up, 2 or 3 of them actually ended up having to testify. And so the Discovery Institute knew, the Center for Science and Culture knew that my testimony was going to hurt them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so that they were trying to discredit me before I ever got to the courthouse.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened when I finally got there, we spent the first half of the first day with the lawyer trying to discredit me and keep me from actually being sworn in.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't work. So I ended up testifying all of the rest of the day and the first part of the next day. So that's the story of how the Discovery Institute tried to discredit me, but it didn't work.
Yeah.
Wow.
They,
Yeah,
they knew they knew my testimony would be
Mhm.
very damaging, and indeed it was, because I simply used the research I had done and told the truth.
Right, exactly. So let's take just a little step back and talk about that case again. And specifically, what was your role whenever you were testifying? What were you testifying about during this case?
Okay, well, there were a number of different experts brought in on behalf of the plaintiffs. The plaintiffs were all parents and a couple teachers, and the lawyers representing the plaintiffs, the parents, and the teachers wanted every aspect of intelligent design covered. So they had
Mhm.
scientists, and there was an educational expert. But the thing that they had to address is what the Discovery Institute, the Center for Science and Culture, I should say, had actually written and published and promoted to be taught in public schools, because that was part of their strategy, part of the wedge strategy that I told you
Mhm.
about, that they were
Right.
promoting to get intelligent design into public schools. And of course, that was what I specialized in. That's
Mhm.
what Paul and I wrote the book about. We wrote the book knowing that we wrote Creationism's Trojan Horse, knowing that eventually some school board would try to adopt, institute the teaching of intelligent design creationism. And this is what the Dover Area School Board was trying to do. So we had the one really authoritative book in which every aspect of intelligent design was discredited. We did a thorough, comprehensive job in analyzing it. And that's why I got called. And so I was called directly to address what the Discovery Institute was advocating in what they called their wedge strategy.
Mhm.
That was rooted in the document that they put out called the wedge document, on how they wanted to wedge their way into the public schools and into American society. And so my co-author, Paul Gross, and I analyzed that as it pertained to getting it into public schools. So I had analyzed every aspect of that document called the wedge document
Mhm.
that the Discovery Institute had drawn up in the Center for Science and Culture in an attempt to get supporters for their effort to promote intelligent design creationism. And Paul and I had researched literally every aspect of that document, the wedge document, how it was produced, who was involved, what it would mean for public education. And so I was able to explain to the court, this was not a jury trial, this was a trial which there was just, the judge was the person who would make the decision. And I was able to show in court that intelligent design is nothing more than a newer form of creationism. It's not science. It didn't belong in the science classroom. And I did that by using the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture's own work. I used their own words to show what they really were, that they were simply another version of creationism. Creationism had been outlawed in public schools by 2 Supreme Court cases, one of which originated in Louisiana, and that it did not qualify as science and could not therefore be legally taught in public schools.
Mhm.
And so that's how I ended up as an expert witness in the Kitzmiller case, based on my work for the book.
Oh, cool.
Gotcha.
We actually have
Mhm.
a student question that just came in for you, Dr.
Okay,
Forrest.
good.
Paige, go ahead.
Sure. We have a question from Alan, who would like to know, how do you feel about intelligent design in private schools?
Private schools can do whatever they want. And there are private schools, typically your Protestant evangelical schools, that teach creationism. They've been around for a long time. And I might add that Catholic schools are typically noted for teaching very good science. Creationism is largely, not exclusively, but largely a Protestant, fundamentalist, and evangelical enterprise. Catholics typically do not get involved because the Catholic Church has long ago accepted the findings of modern science in the study of evolution. And so, I'm sorry, remind me what the question was again?
They were asking about intelligent design in private schools, your opinion.
Yeah, right. Any private school can teach anything they want. They're not owned by, they're not by virtue of the fact that they are private, they can do whatever they want. I wanted to make a distinction between some of the Protestant fundamentalist schools and Protestant evangelical schools, a lot of them teach creationism, and Catholic schools, which typically don't. And so yeah, I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. I'm getting off onto a track. Remind me the question again, please.
The private school.
Yeah, private schools, right. Public schools cannot do that because by virtue of the fact that they are public. They are supported with public money. Yeah. And they must adhere to the Constitution, the United States Constitution, which private schools are not required to do. And the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States provides for a separation of church and state. My mind's back on track now. Thank you. Yeah. The Constitution, the preamble to the Constitution, the First Amendment to the Constitution, not the preamble, the First Amendment to the Constitution establishes the separation of church and state. Right. Creationism is a religious idea. It is not science. It is a religious idea which people are free under the First Amendment to believe from a personal standpoint. You just cannot teach that as science in a public school. Right. And so the difference between private and public schools is that public schools are bound by the Constitution. They are bound by the separation of church and state. They cannot promote religion by teaching religion as science in a public school. And so private schools can do whatever they want. And there are many private schools that teach wonderful science, and Catholic schools are typically very good in that respect. Yeah. The problem comes from the Protestant evangelical schools and the fundamentalist schools. But the public schools are limited to what is out to keeping the promotion of religion inside the school out. It's not that you can never discuss religion in a public school, it's done all the time, but not by presenting a religious viewpoint as science. Okay, right. So the Constitution prohibits that. Private schools can do anything they want to do, but that doesn't mean that all private schools teach creationism. Many, if not most, private schools teach proper science.
Oh, wow. Yeah. With that question, have you seen, we'll say wedge, but let's lowercase it now. Have you seen any wedge movements toward any other subjects besides science? Have you heard of them occurring? Or is just science tend to be the biggest obstacle for those wedge groups, accepting evolution or anything like that?
Okay. Well, the wedge applies strictly to the teaching of evolution. Right. It was done, the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute was most interested in getting intelligent design taught as a scientific alternative to evolution into the public schools. And so the I'm sorry, remind me of your question again.
Yeah, like have you heard of I was saying like lowercase w wedge. Have you seen or heard of any other wedge movements in other subjects?
Oh, well, the newest one is global warming. They're always controversial subjects when it comes to teaching in public schools. There are always people who want to get things into the public schools that are strictly speaking outside the purview of established scholarship. And evolution is established, the study of evolution is established science. And now one of the interesting areas in which the efforts are being made to interfere with teaching it is climate change. And so that's another area. Then the Discovery Institute's not really too much involved in that. Right. But it wasn't part of the original wedge issue, if that was your question. The wedge issue involved the teaching, trying to counteract the teaching of evolution with intelligent design. But there are other areas now trying to get recognized in the study of science, which are not strictly scientific. And that the most current one involves climate change, because there are groups that are trying to prevent the teaching about climate change that has to do with the use of fossil fuels. And those groups are typically They have a bit different agenda than creationists do typically. Their agenda, they're funded by industry groups and things like that.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is though, that the religious right, particularly in Louisiana, jumped on that bandwagon and teamed up with the people who were trying to promote a misunderstanding of the issue of climate change. And in fact, the law in Louisiana, the Louisiana Science Education Act, mentions global warming, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a long time, but because the people promoting are trying to work against education and climate change have allied themselves with creationists.
Yeah. That's interesting. You bring up the religious right, because last week our guest was Dr. Jonathan Osborne. He teaches at LSU, and his work has been on Black conservative rhetoric, African American conservative rhetoric.
Oh,
And yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah. And with that, he says that all that most conservative arguments he bases on Richard Weaver, which is very interesting itself. But he says that the fundamental basis for those arguments is arguments from definition, is what Weaver calls it. So it's based on God, based on what is resolute, based on what can't be tested. It's funny that, or not funny, but it's strange that you say that the religious right that's supported the intelligent design movement is now supporting the this anti-global warming movement, but there's no religious fight in that, is there?
In global, no, it's not typically a religious issue. The reason for the alliance between the people who promote creationism and people who promote the use of fossil fuels is their conservative politics. That's what brings them together. They share a conservative political that has partners. But you can't. I'm not familiar with Richard Weaver's work. I just know that in science, you cannot start with a religious presupposition.
Right.
And one of the interesting things about the Center for Science and Culture and the creationists there, because they are creationists, they like to call themselves intelligent design theorists, but they are creationists. It's the fact that they do start with the presupposition of divine influence, of divine authority. In fact, one of the people there who promotes that, the leader of the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute is a philosopher named Stephen Meyer. And he takes the idea that God's influence has to be presupposed in the workings of nature, that you always have to explain the workings of nature with the presupposition that it is the result of the divine will. And that God is the underlying explanation of everything that happens in the natural world. Well, now you may want to accept that as a personal viewpoint. You just cannot do that in science, because number one, there is no way to establish that there is a divine will.
We lost you, Dr. Forrest. Hold on. We're going to reconnect.
Yeah.
It's not you, Alec. Just give it a minute. What's that shield at the top left corner? Yeah. Oh, shield. 1 second, guys. Dr. Forrest is going to reconnect with us.
Are you back?
Yes, ma'am. We're back.
There
Yeah.
we go.
I was running to check my modem. Okay. So let me get back. The appeal to a divine influence in natural events is, I guess, a universal tendency.
Right.
It is part of people's overarching religious viewpoints. It's not science, and it can't be science because it can't be verified.
Yes,
it can be believed, but not verified by people who don't share. It can't be verified in any way open to the use of the ways of knowing that all humans have.
Yeah. Thank you. We have another question in. Paige, who is it?
It's a student named Tobias, and he would like to know, what are your thoughts on the circulation of popular pseudoscience like flat Earth across media and especially social media?
That is something that we have by virtue of the First Amendment and freedom of speech. There is, one of the wonderful things about being protected by the First Amendment is that you can say almost anything you want in almost any venue that you want. And I certainly endorse the protections of the First Amendment. It's just that anybody, unless you threaten somebody or lie about them, and you can say pretty much anything you want. And so that stuff is all over the place. Fortunately, nobody pays a whole lot of attention to the Flat Earth Society, but there are, unfortunately, quite a few people who pay attention to creationism and who believe that it is science when it is not. And so just as the First Amendment protects people, like it protects organizations like the Discovery Institute to publish pseudoscience and religious ideas disguised as science and propaganda, the First Amendment protects things that we don't consider to be very healthy or constructive. It also gives people like me and people, I'm a philosopher, and people in the scientific community a platform from which to respond. And boy, have we taken advantage of it. And so, there's an awful lot out there that just is not proper science. And unfortunately, in the United States, the level of science literacy is very low. And there are way too many people that don't understand when something is not real science. Or there are too many people who allow their understandings of science to be colored by their prior religious commitments. But I might also add that there are people who are good scientists and who are sincerely religious, whether it's Christianity or Judaism, but people who understand that the way modern science works do not, and I'm talking about people with religious commitments, like some of my friends. And I'll give you an example. Understand that you cannot incorporate your religious preferences into your science. Scientists can't do science that way, which is why you can get 10 scientists in a room, 10 good scientists, and they might all have different religious commitments, but they will all do science the same way. And in doing science, they will all leave their religious commitments out of their science.
Yeah.
And so an example I was going to give you is one of my colleagues who is a scientist, a biochemist, and who is not a biochemist, I'm sorry, he's a biologist. And he is a devout Christian. I won't give his name, but he's a devout Christian. But he never incorporates his religious beliefs into his science. He understands that there is a line that you must respect between your faith commitments, which are unverifiable, which lie beyond the reach of science, and the science that he does in his classroom and in his laboratory.
Yeah.
So thank you for that answer. That was very interesting, actually, because the topic of like pseudoscience such as flat earth has gotten pretty big recently.
Well, unfortunately in the United States there's a very low level of science literacy in this country. And and the internet has made that so much worse. I mean, so much worse. And so sometimes people literally don't know the difference between real science and pseudoscience, and that's a problem that we really do have.
Right.
Because we have so much freedom to consume, so much junk.
Yeah. So we're going to move on to our next question then, which is there is a quote that you have that says the struggle is cyclic. It seems like we haven't heard much from the intelligent design movement or creationism, at least in a nationwide way in a few years. Has it been mostly conquered, or are there still these conversations happening and they just maybe aren't as broadcast anymore?
I'm trying to recall that statement. The struggle is cyclic, page 6. Is that it in our
Yes,
book?
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
keep in mind I have a co-author who wrote, half of that book, and that might be something that that he wrote that I don't recall. But
Mhm.
I guess I don't recall that particular statement in the book. But the struggle is cyclic in the sense that these problems tend to flare up and die down. They come and go. In the United States, since about the 1950s and 60s, we have had a constant problem, almost constant, with creationism.
Mhm.
And there were some extremely important major court cases that went a long way toward resolving the problem. Okay, one of which was a 1968 case which established that creation sciences cannot be taught. Creation science, that term. Okay, and then the other case came out of Louisiana, right? Edwards versus Aguillard. And that case came out of Louisiana, in which creationists, well, if we can't teach creation science, it's in along with it. The out of I think Arkansas. But anyway, I'm having trouble remember the particulars of that case.
Mhm.
But that case established that that you could not teach creationism as science, and so they had to try to get it in some other way. You couldn't. I'm sorry. That case established that you could not prohibit the teaching of evolution.
Mhm.
And so what creationists subsequently did was to try to get creationism alongside evolution. If you can't get evolution out, then let's get creationism in. And that's what the case was about in Edwards versus Aguillard in the state of Louisiana. And that case, the Supreme Court ruling in that, established that you cannot teach creation science alongside evolution because it's not science. Okay, so after that, the creationists had to regroup. And I guess this is what Paul meant when he wrote that, my co-author Paul Gross, when he wrote that the struggle is cyclical, because these things do tend to flare up. They flare up, you think it's gone away, then they come back. So yes, it is cyclical. So after the
We lost you again, Dr. Forrest.
Yeah.
Guys, hold on real quick. Dr. Forrest will be back any second now.
Right.
All right, are we back?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know whether it's probably on my end.
All right.
Mhm.
Because I told you we'd been having trouble.
Yeah, not a big
Right.
deal. It's all good.
Yeah.
It's how it is.
No
Okay,
problem.
Having had the main avenues of teaching creationism closed off to them, creationists had to come up with a new strategy, and that was to use code language. I've written quite a lot about that.
Right.
And so the ways in which they try to get creationism into the classroom now is by teaching, let's say, the arguments against evolution or the strengths and weaknesses of evolution. In other words, to come at it through the back door using code language.
Yeah.
And that's what happened when the Louisiana Science Education Act was passed in 2008. It doesn't mention creationism, except that that's exactly what it's about. And I've lost track of the original question that somebody had asked, I think, about this.
Yeah. Um,
Back to the original question, so I can make.
The original question is asking if you feel like the creationism movement has largely been kind of conquered, or is it still an ongoing debate?
Okay. These people never go away.
Mhm.
Now, the two Supreme Court cases largely took care of the most blatant forms. The Kitzmiller versus Dover case really addressed the use of intelligent design and really foreclosed any avenue of the use of that term, intelligent design, in a science class, which is just another of the euphemisms for creationism. And so that's why the Louisiana Science Education Act does not use the term intelligent design. It doesn't use the term creationism. They had to scrub their terminology, except that those are code words that have been around for a long time. The strengths and weaknesses of evolution, all that kind of stuff. It's code language. And that's the Louisiana Science Education Act is written in code language, which is very easy to identify, which has a long history of being used by creationists. And I have published, Paul and I have published in science journals about the code language that they have used to try to conceal what they are really about. So there's a law on the books in Louisiana, the Louisiana Science Education Act, which is written in creationist code language.
Wow.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have another student question in, Paige.
We have a question from Eva who asks, do you take issue with any existing laws or clauses that you feel affect scientific education?
Do I take issue with any existing laws or causes which I think affect science education? I'm not sure I understand what, this is Paige's question?
No, Eva, a student submitted
Eva's,
it.
Yeah.
okay, Eva's question. I'm not exactly sure what Eva has in mind. Right now, the issue of creationism, honestly, has been, it never totally goes away, but the two Supreme Court cases and the Kitzmiller case, which is a case that applied only in the Middle District of Pennsylvania, to tell you the truth, it was a case up there, but it has had reverberations across the country because of the powerful reasoning of Judge John Jones, who handed down his decision against the teaching of intelligent design in the public school up there. But the issue of creationism from a legal standpoint has been pretty much resolved, which is why we haven't, even though the Louisiana law is on the books, we haven't had any cases come out of, teachers, I think by and large don't want to bother with that stuff, and there's a case in another state, I think it's Tennessee, where it's on the books up there, which was actually the first version of the law that was proposed in Louisiana. Okay, but the issue of creationism is now not very much of a problem. There is a caveat to that, okay, but I'll come back to that in a second. The real issue right now that we have to be concerned about because of its urgency is the attack by industry and the religious right on teaching of climate science. And that is of great urgency because the climate is affecting everybody. And so so the National Center for Science Education was requested by some scientists to add a component in their work. The National Center for Science Education is a nonprofit organization. I was on their board for about 13 years. It's a nonprofit organization in Oakland, California, that was set up to deal with the problem of creationism. They have now incorporated a component to deal with attacks on the teaching of climate science. And the reason they were is because that's now the issue in where the teaching of science is really being attacked. And that's coming mostly from industry and people who sympathize with fossil fuel industry.
Right.
Of course, they're getting support from the religious right on that. Okay, but so the issue now to be concerned about is climate change, because it is so urgent. It is so extremely urgent. The issue of evolution and the attacks on evolution were never a matter of immediate urgency, like everything was gonna come crashing to a halt because some people are teaching creationism in some schools somewhere. But I think now one of the things that has had me thinking about that the last few days is the coronavirus. And there you see, we are dealing with evolutionary variants of that virus. And you've got people refusing to take the vaccines who don't, who just, I think they have political reasons for not wanting to do it. But the pandemic is absolutely the best evidence why science education about evolution, which is a fact of nature, organisms change, they evolve. And whereas now we are feeling that we're more protected because we're getting shots, thanks to modern science, right? Yay. Okay, that's what's going to save us. Modern science, not religion. Modern science is going to save us from the coronavirus, except that viruses evolve. And all that means is that they change, they mutate, they develop. And now we have several variants that hopefully don't lie beyond the reach of these vaccines. But the coronavirus pandemic has now really made me think about the urgency once more of teaching about evolution, because we are living through the results of evolution of an organism in the natural world that has killed, I guess by now, about 1 million people? I'm not sure what the numbers are, but a lot of people. I'm talking about worldwide. So the teaching of evolution, I think now has the same urgency as the teaching of good climate science, because both are a threat to the continuance of the human species.
Cool.
Yeah. Awesome. So earlier you did speak about your friend who is a biologist and also a devout Christian. So along those ideas, on how to think or teach, what is your advice to an individual who is looking to find a compromise between evolution or even science and their religious beliefs? Frozen again.
Yeah. Let's reset it one more. Let's reset it again. It's all good.
I don't like the word compromise because I don't.
There we go.
You cannot change. Wait, something froze. Are we back?
Yes, we're just
we heard
back.
you say you didn't like the word compromise, which we both kind of saw that coming.
Yeah.
Okay. You can't compromise the science. The data are the data, and by now we have so much data that confirm the reality of the evolutionary process in the natural world. That's never going to change. And historically, it's been religion that's had to change to accommodate the science. Science has not changed to accommodate religion. Okay. It is based on the data that science gather through their research. Religion, though, has a history of changing in order to accommodate changing times. And if it didn't, I guess I could try to be funny and say religion evolves, but it really does. And it's fortunate for people who are religious that it does, because it enables religion to survive. But religion has changed over the centuries. And the fact that it has changed in ways that enable people to accommodate the findings of modern science and enjoy the benefits of modern science is fortunate. Now, religion takes many forms. You use the word, and it's such a huge, broad term. Okay, it's very broad. There are as many. Oh gosh, there are hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of different religions. But for religion, people who want to endorse a religious point of view, which is really understandable, because religion has been a source of comfort and support for people. But religion is not the same for all people. There's so many different forms of religion. And you can't, and even among Christians, there's a lot of disagreement about what Christianity is, right? You can be a Christian and believe things that are very different from the person right down the street on the end of your block.
Yeah.
And even though there's a great deal of controversy in science, scientists are bound by a common way of doing their job that they cannot abandon, or else they're not doing science. So back to the original question, there are so many. I would recommend that the student do some research in the mainstream religions that have found a way to accommodate the findings of modern science. And when I say the mainstream religions, I'm talking about Catholicism, because Catholics long ago, to their credit, accepted the findings of modern science. And the mainstream Protestant religions, the Methodists, the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, the people that have trouble with modern science are typically the people that that adhere to the more fundamentalist or religions. The Southern Baptists, unfortunately, have just gone off the wall when it comes to accepting modern science. Even though they used to be the greatest defenders of the separation of church and state. And by the way, this is a church and state separation issue. It's as much that as it is an issue of modern science. It's an issue of keeping religion out of classrooms, which are populated by children from many, many different diverse religious backgrounds, and keeping that as a religion as a source of contention and disagreement out of the educational process. You can do it in a private school, you cannot do it in a public school. So what I would recommend, and let me see really quickly, I was going to look and see if I could find a book. Okay, I don't have it right in front of me, so I can't show it to you. But the student should look into, go to the National Center for Science Education and try to find a little booklet or a document called Religious Voices for Evolution. You can Google that, Religious Voices for Evolution, because the National Center for Science Education, they've revamped the website, and I'm not sure if it's still there, but we published an important little booklet called Religious Voices for Evolution, in which there are statements from all of the mainstream religions in the United States endorsing the teaching of modern science, which includes evolution. You cannot be a fundamentalist or a biblical literalist and endorse the teaching of evolution. That's going to be an obstacle. That's going to get in your way. That's going to be a hindrance. But all of the mainstream religions, not to mention Buddhism, all the mainstream Christian religions, not to mention, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, they have all managed to accommodate the findings of modern science. So there's a lot to be found, to read and to study by people who are interested in that question.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. And I know it's in the book, and it's a lot across a lot of your resume. What is this institute, Natural Institute of, what is the full title for that?
I'm sorry, what is which organization?
The institute that you worked with out of Oakland.
Oh, the National Center for Science Education.
Okay, yes.
National Center, we call it NCSE for short. And I recommend that people go to the NCSE website, and I forget what it is now. They've got a different domain on the end. It used to be ncsc.org. It's not that anymore. But if you Google the National Center for Science Education, you should go and look around their website. That is a small organization which has punched way above its weight in terms of protecting science education. They were integrally involved in the Kitzmiller trial, and they had an expert on site in the courtroom every day for the 6 weeks of that trial. And they deserve as much credit as anybody in the country for protecting the teaching of science in the public schools. And I am very proud to have served on their board for about 13 years.
Yeah, and it's inspiring to hear that they're keeping the fight up with global warming. It wasn't just a one cause fight.
Right. They were actually, we got requests from climate scientists to do that because, once we pretty much, we have pretty much given all the arguments and produced the legal decisions necessary to protect the teaching of evolution. But climate science was something new that needed to be addressed in a slightly different way, because the threat to the teaching of climate science comes not exclusively and not even originally from the religious right, but from industry and people who sympathize with, the fossil fuel industry. So organizations like the Heartland Institute have been instrumental in putting out propaganda against climate science education. So now the NCSE has a very important arm or component. We also are now doing a lot proactively to help teachers and teacher education. So I would recommend that anybody go to the National Center for Science Education website and take a very thorough look around to see what that organization has to offer.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Last question for you, Dr. Forrest. We know you're retired, but are you working on anything, or are you just been chilling out?
I am enjoying a well-deserved chilling out.
Yes.
I mean, it was, people don't understand how much work is involved in doing what I did. I mean,
Yeah.
that was not my day job. My day job was teaching philosophy at Southeastern. And that was a job into which I put a great deal of work, and I loved it. The creationism thing was something I did first as a parent and activist, and fortunately had the background. You didn't mention my PhD dissertation, but I did it on a philosopher by the name of Sidney Hook, who was the most prominent disciple of John Dewey, who was devoted himself to the issue of public education in the United States. And so, having done my dissertation on the work of Sidney Hook, I was well prepared to tackle the issue of creationism, because my dissertation was on the subject of naturalism, that you asked me about.
Yeah.
But I did that. I taught school. I taught at Southeastern for 37 years, and all of my activism was on top of that. And I spent sometimes for a number of years, I wrote at night, and I had to work 7 days a week to get all my research and writing done. And that was hard. Oh, yeah, my family were very patient. They were very patient with me. So now that I don't have to do that anymore, I am 100% involved in my family stuff and just doing whatever I feel like doing.
Yeah.
I figured I had earned my retirement.
Certainly.
Of course,
certainly. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Forrest. Again, ladies and gentlemen out there listening, and all types of folks, this is Creationism's Trojan Horse. This copy is actually from Southeastern's library. Kendall had her copy over there she got from Amazon. It is available on Amazon. Dr. Forrest has a rich catalog of articles and studies that is available on SIM's online database as well if you're interested in digging deeper. We want to thank Dr. Forrest, of course, for joining us, Alec on tech, Paige on questions. We want to thank Dr. Hanson for supporting the colloquium. We'll be off for a couple of weeks, guys. We got spring break coming up. We'll have Dr. Gregory Ulmer at the end of it, and then we'll actually have someone very related. Is Dr. Pete Enns, who has done a lot of work between theology and evolution as part of his career as well. It's not something we did intentionally, but hey, interesting people might gravitate towards similar things. But I am Tyler. This is Kendall. You've been listening to the Iconocast with Southeastern Louisiana University's English Department Colloquium. Hit us up on Instagram, hit up the website, and thank y'all again so much for viewing. Y'all have a wonderful weekend.